Hello, and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council's new show on the most pressing issues impacting transatlantic relations today. My name is Damir Marusic. I'm Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Joining us today is the great Dr. Nathalie Tocci, the Director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. Dr. Tocci, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Damir.
Absolutely. Nathalie, you recently wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs that crystallized for me a set of worries that I've had since the outbreak of Russia's war in Ukraine. It dealt with the possibility of European and Western unity fragmenting in the face of Russian determination. And with Putin's latest speech, his escalation, a call for mobilization, and perhaps even an implicit threat of nuclear retaliation ringing in my ears, I figured we'd start with that. How do you see the situation today in light of Putin's announcement? Will his raising the ante rattle European allies?
Yes, well, I think, this is a story of two interpretations of resilience. Let's say there's Vladimir Putin's interpretation of resilience, and there's what I would define as Jean Monnet's interpretation of resilience. So Putin says, well, resilience is all about our endurance to pain. And, liberal democracies, they are weak, they are morally corrupt, they are just spoiled, with decades of peace and prosperity, and therefore they have a very low threshold of pain endurance. Jean Monnet, I was kind of, reading his memoirs again last summer. He has this wonderful citation in which he says, Europe is going to be the product of the solutions that it will find to its crises. And hence this idea of, in a sense, resilience understood as the ability to change and to transform. Now, I think, in the context of this war, the jury is out, right? The jury is out. Is Putin or Monnet going to win the day? Are we going to crack because indeed our level of pain endurance is too low? Or are we going to be able, perhaps in our slow and slightly messy and certainly suboptimal way, but to weather the storm and to navigate the storm? I would say that although the jury is out, my personal bet at this point in time is actually that Monnet is going to win the day. But as I said, we are in the midst of the storm.
The other big story, Dr. Tocci, then today, I hope you're right on the Monnet question. But the other big question, the big story this week is the Italian elections coming up. And all the polls seem to be showing Giorgia Meloni of the nationalist and Eurosceptic party very much ahead. And the coalition looks to be with Matteo Salvini's Lega Nord, which is a Russophilic party, and Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia. How do you think all of this shakes out given these new realities? I take your point that you're broadly hopeful that Europe will persevere, but do you think that especially in light of the most recent announcements by Vladimir Putin, that how does this shake out?
Well, a couple of reflections there. It's very clear that, Putin was very happy to see Mario Draghi go. Draghi is certainly no friend of the Kremlin's in terms of his support for sanctions, especially his role in devising sanctions together with Secretary Yellen on the Russian central bank. Really played a pivotal role there. Played a pivotal role in getting Berlin and Paris on board the idea of granting EU candidacy to Ukraine. So, really one can go through a set of different questions and basically sort of see how certainly Putin was happy to see him go. Now, does that necessarily mean that therefore a Meloni-led government is going to, be a gift to Putin? Well, it depends. And this is where, again, this is why I say the jury really is out. Now, why do I say this? If you take the current Italian parliament, you look at which are the pro-Kremlin parties in this parliament, therefore the outgoing parliament, I would say that 60%, if you add together the Five Star Movement, the Northern, no longer Northern, the League led by Matteo Salvini, and indeed Berlusconi's Forza Italia, you take those three together, and in terms of their seats in parliament, it comes down to 60%. Those three parties, which I would define as being the pro-Kremlin parties in parliament, if current polls are right, will be lucky if they see collectively their size in parliament being halved. Now, you may say, well, yes, but, you're going to have Salvini in government. And I would reply, well, didn't we have him? The Draghi government, let's not forget, has two of those three parties, Lega and Forza Italia, and indeed the Five Star Movement being coalition partners in his government. And if you take the position of Giorgia Meloni herself, I would definitely agree with you that she is at heart a Eurosceptic and a nationalist. However, she is also at heart an Atlanticist. In fact, I would say that, when it comes to identity, perhaps, sort of related to slightly disturbing reasons, which I think are mainly related to her attitudes towards migration. But this is the kind of white Christian West, right, against the rest. And this is, in a sense, what she does believe in. Now, she doesn't obviously believe in European integration. But there I would say, yes, that's true. But here we are in the midst of an energy crisis, of an economic crisis, of a war. We're not in the Eurozone crisis. We're not in the migration crisis. We're not at a time in which you can actually mess around with Europe too much. Remember that Europe at this point in time gives us money. It doesn't ask us for money. And so even if you are a Eurosceptic, well, there's a limit to how much, unless you're totally dumb, which I think she's not, there's a limit to how much you can actually show that Euroscepticism. Now, if for the sake of argument, we end up, and hopefully we will, weathering this storm, so if Jean Monnet is right, well then, in some respects, that will be the moment in which if Meloni is Prime Minister and she will be Prime Minister at that time, that will be the time in which perhaps in this respect we start entering into danger zone, because that will be the time in which it will be more possible in a sense to lower the mask to the extent that it will be a mask of moderation that is put on. But, let's weather the storm first.
Well, so let me press you on that, because I think, the figure of Meloni is fascinating because of this kind of almost traditional conservatism known in the sense of being anti-migrant, but also the Euroscepticism against integration, as you put it. I mean, there are issues outside of Russia and the Ukraine war that are bedeviling Europe right now, not least of which is the fight, say, against Viktor Orban and his illiberalism, and questions such as those. We've also seen the rise of far-right parties in Sweden as well. And I mean, I don't want to belabor the question of the rise of the right across Europe, because I mean, so many pieces have been written about that. At this point, it's almost an overdone thesis. Yet, nevertheless, the tide keeps rising, and one wonders whether at some point Europe becomes very difficult to govern. Are we getting there? Perhaps? Are you worried about that? And maybe can get you to brainstorm a little bit about some of the issues less than the Putin question, less than the Ukraine question, where a Meloni-led Italy may prove to be a real challenge to European governance.
So, on the rise of the right, I mean, is there a sort of, unstoppable rise of the right, and especially the populist right? I mean, I think one could definitely tell that story up until the pandemic. I mean, it's clear that if you take the decade from the global financial crisis up until COVID-19, that indeed this was the story. And why was it the story? I would argue because the crises that we faced, we did overcome them, but we didn't overcome them particularly well. I mean, we didn't handle the Eurozone crisis particularly well, frankly speaking. We certainly didn't handle the migration crisis particularly well. And it was that mishandling, or just doing barely enough to remain standing, that explained, in my view, certainly in Europe, I think in the US one could tell a different story, but certainly in Europe, explained why you had that seemingly unstoppable wave. Now, I would argue that obviously, the populist right is still there, but I don't think that actually since the pandemic they have been on the rise. In fact, I would say that in the case of Italy, whereas I would define Meloni definitely right, hard right, I would actually not define her as populist right. In a sense, she's kind of an actually ideologically committed right, which, may be even more disturbing perhaps in some respects. But I don't think this is a story of populism. So is Sweden and Italy, does this kind of signal the resumption post-COVID of, this kind of wave that perhaps slightly calmed down and now it's up again? I think, to be honest, again, it will depend on how we manage this crisis. I think that there is a reason why that wave of nationalist populism actually, subsided, relatively speaking, or at least didn't continue growing during the pandemic, and it could have done. And I think the reason why it didn't is that actually we handled the pandemic relatively well. If we handle the energy and the economic fallout of this war, and there will be a fallout, there is a fallout, but if it's a fallout that, in a sense, if handled well, resembles more the pandemic than the Eurozone crisis, so if we get the policy recipe right rather than wrong, and it becomes a 1 or 2 year crisis rather than a 6 or 7 year crisis, I'm actually quite confident that this will not be a moment of nationalist Eurosceptic rise once again. Look, Meloni will be, if she sticks to the one friend she has around the European Council, called indeed Viktor Orban, she would be very lonely. And again, she's many things, but I don't think she's dumb. And so she will actually try and make other friends. And at the moment, we're not at a time in which we have a cohesive Visegrad group in which she could have, jumped on that ship. There isn't any such thing. And so, do you really just want to be friends with the pariah around the European Council called Viktor Orban? Or isn't it wiser and smarter to try and make friends elsewhere? It will not be easy for her because, she doesn't have a lot of credibility. Her reputation is certainly not great. But this is, my guess is that this is what she's going to try and do.
So let me ask you a different sort of area that I never actually hear Italian politicians talk about. And it's having to do with enlargement. And that's one of the issues that the Ukraine war has brought to the front of European politics, with the nod being given to Ukraine and Moldova. I work on the Western Balkans here, and that's really the focus of our work is European enlargement. Just in a 2 weeks, I think, in October 6th, there's going to be a meeting of the first meeting of the European political community, the sort of French proposal, which on the surface is not meant to be an alternative to enlargement, but I think is largely understood as at least a holding pen. How would a Meloni government basically look at something like that? Are we looking at maybe Euroscepticism finding allies in that regard, sort of hiding behind this idea that, for Europe to work, it needs to be reformed, but there's no consensus on what the reforms are, so just a break on everything? Is that likely?
No, I actually guess that, her Euroscepticism is going to come out, let me perhaps kind of make a sort of, a slightly strange parallel. It's going to come out in a British way. I don't mean Brexit here. What I mean is that when the United Kingdom was a member of the European Union, because it was deep down a Eurosceptic member of the European Union, it was actually traditionally in favour of enlargement. So Meloni's someone who would, I think would sort of ideologically resist the idea of reforms meant to further integrate and federalize the European Union, but she's quite happy, and I think she does actually see the EU in this respect in a more sort of geopolitical and geostrategic sense, and therefore sees actually enlargement as the enlargement of the West. So in this respect, I think it echoes more perhaps the way in which enlargement and the European project in general is also seen across the Atlantic. I mean, I thought there was one remark that she made last week when There was this whole sort of, hoo-ha about a report put out by the European Parliament that essentially defined Hungary as being an electoral autocracy, which then opened the way to the Commission essentially proposing the suspension of the cohesion funds to Hungary. And Meloni voted against this definition. And the argument that she made was, I thought, a rather interesting one, because she did not say, I vote against this, or my party votes against this because we think that Hungary is a shining democracy. I mean, she did make sort of odd remarks about the fact that, Orban wins election, as if that was the only criterion to define a democracy. But she also said something else which I thought was quite interesting, which is, at this point in time, is it better to have Hungary in or out? And this kind of echoes back to this idea of the strategic rationale of enlargement as well. At this point in time, is it better to have Serbia in or out? If we talk about NATO, at this point in time, is it better to have Turkey in or out, right? So, you can argue it both ways, because of course you can't simply paper over the fact that there are very serious democracy and rule of law problems. But in a sense, there is a strategic rationale there that one can have a serious conversation about.
So let me then just wrap us up here with what will Italy's winter look like this year? I mean, that's, I think, the question on a lot of people's minds in every country across the Union. It's something that we're thinking about a lot and trying to sort of strategize around at the Atlantic Council as well. Give us a sense of what the next few months ahead look like for Italy.
Well, I mean, certainly an expensive winter. I don't think it's going to be a cold winter. I don't think it's going to be a cold winter, essentially because Italy moved very, very fast on quantities, and then we can have the price conversation. But on quantities, it moved very fast at the beginning of this war. And so I think in terms of quantities, if you add Algeria and Azerbaijan and LNG contracts, which will be coming online at the beginning of 2023, coupled with the fact that we're probably going to get to around 93% of storage, I think quantity-wise, if the winter is relatively mild, it shouldn't be a problem. Yes, it's true we're going to get to spring with very low storage levels, but at that point the additional LNG will really start coming online. So I'm less worried about quantities. The big issue is price. And of course that's not just an Italian story, that's broadly a European story. Now, to kind of, perhaps end, though, on a positive note there, I think it will largely, which connects back to this idea of, how do we handle this crisis? There is nothing written in stone here. I think what was extremely interesting a couple of weeks ago was that, a couple of weeks ago was really the week in which Putin, on the energy blackmail, lowered the last mask. So essentially admitting that Nord Stream was not going to be reopened so long as sanctions are in place. Now, one would have thought that would have been the week in which prices would have gone even further up the roof, even beyond the 350 euros per megawatt hour that they had already peaked at. And yet what happened? Those prices started falling. And now they are still extremely high at 200 euros. Why did they start falling? They started falling because the market started expecting a decision at European level. We're not there yet. We haven't actually reached a decision on price caps and decoupling of gas and electricity markets and capping the remuneration of inframarginal technologies. I mean, this is kind of complex stuff, both the temporary and even more so the structural measures that need to be taken. But the very fact that we're actually working on this has sent important signals to the market, and the market has reacted. So all this to say that Putin has already played his last card. And there's nothing else that he can do other than keeping the tap off as he's doing. And I think it will largely depend on how we react to see whether, on the one hand, the quantities, but also the prices can be contained.
Dr. Tocci, Nathalie, thank you so much for joining us here on Atlantic Debrief. And good luck this winter. And may, as you say, the positive vision of Europe win out.
Thank you. Lovely talking to you.